Orchids have a reputation for being difficult to grow when in fact many varieties make excellent houseplants. Tracy Calla, a horticulturist with Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, shares what you need to know to keep your orchids alive and thriving.
Perhaps you've been drawn in by beautiful displays of orchids here in our tropical conservatory or at garden centers or home improvement places. Orchids are beautiful and exotic, but they have an undeserved reputation for having similarly exotic care requirements. If you're not really sure how to care for your orchid, first have to know what kind of orchid you have. That will definitely make the difference in the care requirements for your orchid. Once you have the name of your orchid, you can look it up on the internet or you can inquire with a skilled gardening friend. So if your orchid has a pseudobulb, it's a pretty good guess that it likes to dry out really well before you water it again. In the case of something like this Phalaenopsis here, it doesn't have a pseudobulb, and it's what's called a monopodial orchid, and it likes to be a little bit more moist. So you can treat it a little bit more like an average houseplant. Let it dry out just a little bit, and then water it again. Don't water your orchids with ice cubes. Water it like you mean it. When it's time to water, whether that be in 4 days or 2 weeks, completely water the plant. Moisten the soil, let the water drain through, and then allow it to dry before putting it back in its decorative pot or back on the table. Don't let your orchid sit in a saucer of water because that will rot the roots and your orchid will decline quicker than it would if you were just to allow it to dry out. One quick way to find out if your orchid needs water is to look at the roots themselves. In the case of, say, this dendrobium here, who has the roots visible, if they're silver and kind of a little bit shriveled, it might need to be watered. If they're white or green and very firm, it doesn't need any water today. Another question that we field pretty often is, do I need to repot it? When do I repot it? How do I repot it? Orchids, as I said, are epiphytes, and they grow on trees or possibly on rocks. So their medium tends to be very loose and very airy, and it allows a lot of water flow around the plant's roots. So your orchid, if it has roots sticking out, doesn't necessarily need to be repotted. These are air roots, and that's normal for an epiphyte. If, however, the plant is distorting the pot, or if it's way out over the edge of your pot, it's probably time to repot it. A typical orchid mix is something with bark and charcoal and maybe perlite or sponge rock, which is a big perlite. That allows for good drainage and good air movement. Keep your orchids in a bright, airy, somewhat humid location, and they'll reward you with blooms next year. If you have any questions about orchids, come by Selby Gardens and ask one of our knowledgeable volunteers or post a comment onto our Facebook page.